In the stark, sterile theater of death, Dr. Evelyn Hartwell was the undisputed sovereign. For 19 years, the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office had been her kingdom, a realm of stainless steel and silent testimony. In that time, she had performed over 4,000 autopsies, charting every conceivable map of human mortality the city of Chicago could offer, from quiet departures to the most brutal and violent finales. She had come to believe she had seen it all, that the body held no more surprises for her. She was wrong.
Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed, tap that like button, and tell us in the comments where in the world are you listening from? Now, take a slow breath, clear your mind, and stay with us till the very end. Because sometimes, the truth isn't loud, it whispers hidden in the details.
My name is Dr. Evelyn Hartwell, and this is the record of what transpired on a Thursday evening in November. It began as a routine examination, another sad but simple statistic for the city's ledgers, an apparent suicide. The case was that of Adrienne Holt, a 31-year-old accountant from Lincoln Park. He had been found by his landlord, summoned by the complaints of a cloying odor from concerned neighbors. According to the initial police report, the scene was tragically self-explanatory. Holt was discovered in his bathroom, having seemingly hanged himself with a leather belt from the shower rod. The circumstances formed a neat, unfortunate narrative. Holt was navigating a bitter divorce, had recently lost his prestigious job at a downtown accounting firm, and possessed a documented history of depression, for which antidepressants had been prescribed. His ex-wife confirmed a recent, steep decline into despondency, and his therapist reported he had missed his last 3 scheduled appointments. Every piece pointed to a tragic, yet regrettably common, conclusion. The body arrived at our facility on Thursday morning. However, a backlog from a weekend of particularly relentless city violence meant I couldn't begin the examination until nearly 7 p.m. By then, the building had exhaled its daytime occupants, leaving only the spectral hum of machinery, the night security guard, and me. I've always preferred the quiet hours. The profound stillness allows for an unbroken communion with the dead, a singular focus on the meticulous work forensic pathology demands. I commenced with the standard external examination, my camera flashing as I photographed the body from multiple angles, documenting the visible signs of asphyxiation. The ligature mark encircling Holt's neck was consistent with hanging, presenting the characteristic inverted V pattern that pointed to the knot's position at the back of the neck. There was the expected facial congestion and petechial hemorrhaging, tiny, burst capillaries in the eyes, both classic indicators of asphyxial death. What struck me as discordant, however, was the condition of Holt's hands. In hanging cases, it is common to find defensive injuries, scratches and abrasions on the neck, skin and fibers under the nails, where the victim instinctively claws at the constricting ligature in their final, panicked moments. Holt's hands bore no such marks. His fingernails were immaculate, unbroken. For a man who had supposedly fought for his last breath against a belt, his hands were remarkably, unervingly pristine. I carefully documented the observation and proceeded. At 7:23 p.m., I activated the Autopsy Suite standard recording system. As I began the internal examination, the fluorescent lights overhead hummed their familiar electrical mantra, and the ventilation system maintained its steady, sighing circulation. Everything was routine, methodical, precisely as it should be. I made the standard Y incision and began the exploration of Holt's internal landscape. His heart showed no signs of disease, his lungs were clear, his liver normal for a man of his age. Yet, as I worked, I began to notice a constellation of small details that refused to align with the narrative of a straightforward suicide. Holt's stomach contents revealed he had consumed a full meal, take-out Chinese food, within 2 to 3 hours of his death. This was highly unusual for an individual planning to take their own life. Furthermore, there was no trace of alcohol or illicit drugs in his system, only the prescribed antidepressants at therapeutic levels. Most people contemplating suicide either abstain from food or use substances to numb their psychological agony. More puzzling still was the state of his attire. Holt was dressed in a clean white dress shirt, crisply pressed slacks, and polished shoes, hardly the expected attire for someone spending their final day in suicidal despair at home. His clothes were immaculate, showing no wrinkles, tears, or signs of a struggle that would indicate he had been restrained or fought an assailant. I returned to Holt's neck, examining the ligature mark more closely. It was then I noticed something that made me pause. While consistent with hanging, the mark itself possessed a bizarre quality. A belt, with its varying texture and thickness, typically leaves an impression that differs in depth and width. Holt's mark was preternaturally uniform, as if the pressure had been applied with perfect, unwavering consistency across the entire circumference of his neck. I photographed it from every angle, my calipers confirming the depth was consistent to within a millimeter all the way around, a phenomenon I had never before encountered in a hanging. It was possible, I reasoned, that the belt had been positioned with surgical perfection and Holt's weight had distributed the pressure with flawless equilibrium, but the probability felt vanishingly small. As I continued, I became aware of a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. The temperature seemed to have dropped, a chill seeping into the air, though the digital thermostat still read a steady 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The air felt heavier, more oppressive, as if a storm were gathering within the sterile walls. A quick check of the weather forecast on my phone showed clear skies predicted for the entire evening. I was in the process of removing Holt's brain for examination when I heard the first sound that had no right to be there. It was faint, a soft, rhythmic tapping, barely audible above the drone of the ventilation system. It was deliberate. I froze, my scalpel poised, and listened. The sound ceased. Shaking my head slightly, I resumed the examination, carefully sectioning Holt's brain, searching for any sign of trauma or pathology. The tissue was normal, no evidence of bleeding, swelling, or any other abnormality that might explain his death. But then the tapping returned, more distinct this time, seeming to emanate from somewhere deep within the walls of the autopsy suite. Its steady, coded rhythm reminded me of Morse code. I fought to ignore it, to focus on the task at hand, but concentrating became a battle. The tapping would start and stop at random intervals, a phantom communication with no discernible pattern or source. While examining Holt's hands again under magnification, I made another deeply disturbing discovery. Though his fingernails were clean of any defensive evidence, there were minuscule puncture marks on his fingertips. 8 tiny wounds, 4 on each hand, located precisely where his own fingernails would have pressed into his palms had his hands been clenched into impossibly tight fists. The wounds were nearly invisible to the naked eye, but the microscope revealed their clear, defined nature. They appeared self-inflicted, as if Holt had dug his nails into his own flesh with tremendous force. But here was the paradox: there were no corresponding marks on his palms. It was a phantom grip, the evidence of immense pressure without a corresponding point of impact. I documented these baffling findings with photographs and meticulous notes, my mind racing to find a scenario that could accommodate them. The tapping sound had now evolved, becoming more complex. It was no longer a simple rhythm but what sounded uncannily like a conversation, 2 distinct patterns, one from the wall behind the examination table, the other from near the ceiling, seeming to respond to each other. I found myself listening, trying to decipher a meaning that I knew, rationally, could not exist. At 9:15 p.m., I found it. The discovery that shattered the case wide open. While examining Holt's neck tissue under the microscope, I found evidence not of one, but of multiple ligature marks. Beneath the obvious one visible on the surface were several fainter, older impressions. The tissue showed signs of repeated trauma, as if a ligature had been applied, tightened, and removed multiple times before the final, fatal application. This was utterly inconsistent with suicide. A person does not practice hanging themselves. This pattern screamed of torture, of repeated episodes of strangulation, perhaps as a method of interrogation before the final act was staged to kill him. I carefully collected the tissue sample, knowing the DNA analysis would take days. But the discovery renewed my resolve. As I was photographing the evidence, the lights in the autopsy suite flickered and died for a split second, plunging the room into absolute blackness before humming back to life. The sound of the ventilation system changed, becoming labored and irregular, as if it were struggling for breath. I checked the environmental controls, everything appeared normal. Yet, something in the room had irrevocably shifted. My final pass of the internal organs revealed another inconsistency. In a typical hanging, gravity pulls the blood to the lower parts of the body, creating distinct lividity patterns. Holt's blood pooling was inconsistent with the position in which he was supposedly found. The pattern strongly suggested his body had been moved after death, repositioned to create the illusion of a hanging. It was then that I heard a new sound, not the rhythmic tapping, but something that sounded terrifyingly like whispering. It was so faint at first that I dismissed it as an auditory illusion, a trick of a tired mind. But it persisted, a soft, sibilant sound that rose and fell like quiet, urgent conversation, seeming to come from just beside the examination table. I stood perfectly still, straining to listen. The sound was undeniably there. It wasn't mechanical, it was organic. The whispering continued, growing gradually more distinct, though I could never make out the words. I resolved to finish as quickly as possible. The accumulating strangeness, the cold, the tapping, the flickering lights, and now the whispering, had left me genuinely unnerved. As I completed my examination and prepared to leave, the whispering intensified, seeming to come from multiple directions at once, as if the room were full of people having hushed conversations just beyond my range of hearing. At 11:47 p.m., I finished my documentation and sealed Holt's body. I took one last look around the autopsy suite. On the surface, everything was normal. But the air itself felt tainted, contaminated by the violence of Adrienne Holt's death, a residue that no amount of disinfectant could ever wash away. I left quickly, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous building. In the deserted parking garage, I couldn't shake the oppressive feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every distant sound made my heart leap. The drive home through the empty Chicago streets was a blur of paranoia, my eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror. Over the next few days, Detective Dorsey's renewed investigation bore terrifying fruit. He uncovered disturbing connections between Holt's death and 3 other recent suicides in the Chicago area. 3 other men, all in their 30s, all experiencing personal or professional turmoil, had died by hanging in the past 6 months. Re-examining their files, Dorsey and his team found the same subtle inconsistencies: immaculate fingernails, unusual lividity, clothes that were too neat. The DNA analysis of the skin fragment from Holt's fingernail came back with a match: a 42-year-old former military contractor named Gabriel Rohr, a man with a history of violence and connections to several unsolved homicides in other states. Rohr had been in Chicago during the time of all 4 deaths. But before he could be arrested, Rohr was found dead in a motel room on the south side, the cause an apparent heroin overdose. He had no history of drug use. The investigation eventually untangled a massive financial fraud scheme at a major investment firm, in which all 4 victims had been complicit. Someone had lost millions and, deciding the justice system was too slow, had hired Rohr to exact their own. He was to eliminate them one by one, staging their deaths as suicides fueled by guilt and shame. The mastermind was a ghost. The payments to Rohr were traced through a dizzying maze of shell companies and offshore accounts until the trail went cold. The case was officially closed, a series of homicides committed by Gabriel Rohr, who subsequently died of a drug overdose. But I knew the truth. The real killer, the architect of this meticulous campaign of death, was still out there, a phantom of wealth and vengeance who had vanished without a trace. What disturbed me most wasn't just the cold, calculated nature of the murders, but the chilling realization of how close they came to remaining undetected. If I had dismissed the small inconsistencies, if I hadn't pushed past the obvious narrative, for murders would have been immortalized in the public record as suicides. That case changed me. I now approach every body that arrives on my table with a new level of suspicion, a new respect for the subtle lies a scene can tell. But what haunts me most from that night isn't the forensic evidence, it's the memory of those sounds. The tapping. The whispering. The palpable sense of a presence in that room. I have spent countless solitary hours in that same autopsy suite since, but I have never again experienced anything like it. I try to rationalize it as stress-induced hallucination, my subconscious piecing together clues my conscious mind had yet to process. But another, deeper part of me cannot shake the feeling that something else was in that room with me. Something that wanted Adrienne Holt's story to be told. Perhaps it was a supernatural presence, a spirit refusing to let an injustice stand. Or perhaps it was simply my own intuition, manifesting in the language of the uncanny. I don't know which explanation is more disturbing. What I do know is that Adrienne Holt's case taught me that the most terrifying evil isn't always loud and brutal. Sometimes, it's methodical, patient, and intelligent. And sometimes, if you listen closely enough, in the profound silence of the morgue, you can hear the truth, whispered from the shadows. The case remains a stark reminder that in forensic pathology, you must listen for the stories that are not being told. And sometimes, late at night, when the building is quiet, I think I can still hear the tapping, the whispering. And I listen. I will always listen. Because in the end, that is my job, to give a voice to those who can no longer speak, and to ensure their final testimony is heard. Especially when it comes in whispers from an empty room.